So I'm going to talk about biological rhythms to social rhythms, and I'll tell you about a 20-year study of premature infants who received kangaroo care, skin-to-skin contact, when they were neonates, and the impact it has on their development and on the social brain. And I'd like to start with some images from Louise Bourgeois, an artist, a sculptor, a writer, a mother, a feminist who was preoccupied throughout her career with the mother body, the wonder that we come out of someone's body and what a profound influence this has on us throughout our life. So what does it mean to be born a mammal? Mammalian young are born with two important constraints. Their brain is immature at birth, and young maintain close contact to a nursing mother. And this means that all support systems of the body, all physiological periodicities, the sleep-wake cycle, diurnal rhythms of hormones, the heart rhythms, developed in young mammals in relation to the mother's body and its unique provisions. At birth, the human infant is the least neurologically mature primate of all and the most reliant on physiological regulation by the caregiver for the longest period of time. Or as Sarah Hardy says, for species such as primates, the mother is the environment. And I would add, the mother's body is the environment that gives support to the development of the infant's biological rhythm. And there is like 50 years of work in animal models that systematically show, I'm thinking about the work of Myron Hofer or Gig Levine, that proximity to the mother's body or separation from the mother's body. So proximity to the mother's body provide the context for the development of all these environment-dependent abilities and systems: arousal and attention regulation, autonomic maturation, motor organization, temperature regulation, sleep organization, brain maturation, particularly the social brain and the brain system that sustain our capacity to manage stress, stress management, and of course, bonding and affiliation, and the oxytocin system. So all these develop in all mammals in relation to the mother's body and its provision, particularly in primate and particularly in humans, the crown of creation, who are born the least mature of all. And this is how the biological rhythms give rise or provide support for the development of the emotion regulation. So in the newborn period, we have biological regulation. This gives rise to emotion regulation in the first year, to attention regulation in toddlers. And by preschool, children already have a sense of self, and they develop mechanism of self-control. All these support the emotion regulatory abilities in adolescent, the capacity to manage stress, executive functions, behavior inhibition, the ability to manage accident proneness, and less psychopathology. And they develop step by step. One leads to the other. But there's also, when we do longitudinal research, we see that there is a direct link between the regulation and the organization of biological rhythms in the newborn period, directly impact the ability of the adolescents. This gives rise to the development also of mother-infant biobehavioral synchrony. Biobehavioral synchrony is defined as the coordination of biology and behavior between mother and infant during moments of social contact. And this is the way mothers externally regulate the infant physiological systems and tune them to the social world. So when mother and infant coordinate their behavior in the gaze, affect, vocal, and touch modality, there's also coordination of mother and infant heart rhythms. There's a coordinated release of oxytocin, and there's brain-to-brain synchrony in key nodes of the social brain. Biobehavioral synchrony also develops like expanding ripples from the newborn to the adolescent. Parental behavior in the newborn stage, nonverbal synchrony in the first year of life. In toddler, we begin to co-create symbolic play with our parents, and this leads in the preschool to the construction of much more elaborated episodes of imaginary play. And those lead to co-regulatory outcomes, regulation of social abilities in adolescent, empathy, the ability to dialogue multiple perspectives, conflict management, and the development of self-disclosure and intimacy, using the same type of step-by-step development, but also the importance of what is happening in the sensitive period, so that the early synchrony in the first year of life directly predicts those outcomes in adolescence and young adulthood. Synchrony also goes across human social bonds. So we saw behavioral synchrony, autonomic synchrony, hormonal synchrony, and brain synchrony, and they are found in various formats in parent-infant relationship, in romantic attachment between partners, between close friends, and with fellow humans. Humans are the only species that coordinate their biology and social behavior with total strangers. What happens when infants are born prematurely? And we're talking about millions of the world's children each year. It's between 10 and 11% of live birth in Western society. And with time, we're able to save smaller and smaller infants that are born sicker and sicker. So this is really something that we should consider, given all what we've said about the importance of the mother's body for the development of those physiological rhythms and support system. What happens when the infant is very premature? The brain needs a lot of maturation, but the child is deprived of the mother's body and is placed in incubator. And this is the picture from Harry Harlow, famous monkeys. And what happened to the monkey, that after a period of a day or 2 days of being separated from the mother, the first system that melted down were the physiological rhythms, the support system of the body. And here on the right, you see the baby, the premature baby, immature brain at birth. So here you have this paradox that those infants who need the mother's physical presence the most are the ones who deprive of it, and the question is, how would they develop these physiological support systems? So we actually started in '96. The cohort that I'm going to tell you about that we followed for 20 years were born from '96 to '99. In '93, a paper came in Pediatrics where they reported on an experiment. Actually, it was necessity as a mother of invention that was conducted in Bogota, Colombia. They didn't have sufficient incubators. So they had, like, the village raised the child, premature infants. The whole village wore the infants because premature infants lose their body heat and they can die. So mother and father and auntie and grandma, everybody wore the baby for 24 hours until the infant matured and was able to regulate his or her own body heat. But what they noticed was not only that across the first year of life, those infants had similar rates of mortality and morbidity, and they realized that the kangaroo care was a safe method, but also that those infants were calmer. So that the nurses that did the well baby visits and the doctors who gave vaccination noticed that those infants had better stress management. The mothers reported that they cried less. So they realized that this thing did something good to the children beyond the fact that it saved the children who otherwise wouldn't be able to survive. But they didn't do any scientific experiment, and nobody had ever known that this is something that you could do when you do have incubator, and you just do it for improving the baby's life. But we, based on all this animal research, said, hey, maybe if you provide maternal bodily contact during a period of maternal separation, this is exactly what the infant would need for the development of all these biological rhythms, and of those would be, like I told you before, the emotion regulation, attention regulation, self-regulation, etc., consequences in adolescence. Let's do it. And we actually built our kangaroo care intervention on the 3 principles that are important to keep in mind when you build an intervention for young children. The The first is assuming specificity. You need to build your intervention on mechanisms that have been proven in animal models. So you know the mechanism. You don't just come and, if you play with kids, you're nice to kids, and you make eye contact, it would be great for everybody. But we wanted specific mechanisms that are disrupted in these premature infants, and that we want that our intervention would target those specific mechanisms. Okay? Specificity is also the predicted outcome. We didn't think that kangaroo care would improve everything. It's not going to lower the time when infants begin to walk, like non-motor development. But it would, particularly regulatory abilities, mother-infant synchrony, stress management will be improved by proximity to the mother's body. The second is considering sensitive period. If you apply an intervention during the sensitive period, those periods when the brain is open to that kind of experience, even a small dose can go a long way, can make a lasting impact on the brain. So maternal physical contact is what a neonate needs. We are giving this. That should help us, go along. We didn't think at that time that we're going to be with them for 20 years, but we thought maybe that would give them a jump start. And the second thing is that you target individually stable ability. So if we make a little bit, think about the butterfly effect. If you make a little bit of change in the physiological periodicities, in the body rhythms, that it would set in motion a developmental trajectory that will improve itself, like a feedback loop, and everything would be better. So this is why we decided to go in as a randomized clinical trial. And what I'd add over here is that this ability is no longer possible. This is why we think our sample is so precious, because at that time, nobody knew about the kangaroo care. So we were able to randomize it in 2 different hospitals and then cross over. But now everybody knows about kangaroo care, and every mother wants to do it. And you can't just tell a mother, you can't touch your infant because your number came out in the control. So this was a precious ability, like a window of ability, before anyone knew about the kangaroo care and that it's actually good for you. And we really hypothesized these 2-pronged process where we expected that proximity to the mother's body would impact the infant regulatory system from physiological to emotional to attentional to self, and it would improve mother-infant synchrony, and that those 2 lines of improvement, little by little, would influence each other in a mutually influencing way and leading to improved developmental outcomes. So we recruited 146 mother preterm pairs. They were randomized to kangaroo care and control. We specifically selected infants with no neurological damage so that they could develop normally. They were very preemies. They were small, between 530 and 715 grams, because we wanted that there would be at least a 2-week period when those infants would be, the control would be deprived of contact and the kangaroo care would receive contact. In order to enlist in our studies, mothers had to sign that they would provide kangaroo care for at least an hour a day for at least 14 consecutive days. Okay, most mothers did much more than that, more than 14 days, more than an hour a day. But this is what they needed in order to enlist. Now, it's important for me to say here a point that over and over we have registered. We took note of how much kangaroo care they did, the nurses took every day. And at the end of the day, for the vast majority of outcome, the difference was between whether you did or didn't get contact. And that is reassuring because you don't have to provide 5 hours of contact. It's enough an hour a day to make this whole thing better. So a lot of time, parenting is not a lot of it. It's doing it in the right time and the right way. And people often ask me, why didn't we recruit fathers? And so I'm answering it right now. we recruited without a problem 146 mothers, 73 to do Kangaroo. We were able to recruit 3 fathers because fathers said, I will do all 7 hours on the weekend, but I'm not willing to come every day to do an hour. And we said, no, you have to do it every day. I think it was 23 years ago. I would imagine that there was massive change in fatherhood over those 20-some years, and nowadays we would be able to recruit fathers without any, but it's very interesting to see the change that happened in paternal care. So this is the overall study protocol. We saw kids 9 times before Kangaroo, and then there was the 14 days of the Kangaroo. At 37 weeks gestation, just before they left the hospital, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months, those were corrected to full gestation. And then at 5 years, 10 years, and 18 to 20 years, at each time point, there were 4 topics that we targeted: mother-child interaction, emotion regulation, physiological processes, and cognitive assessment. Here is before they leave the hospital. So we videotape mother-infant interaction. We just let them play with each other in an empty room for 10 minutes. And we microcode their behavior. And we saw that after Kangaroo, mother provided much more positive affect, more visual regard of the child, more touch of the child. And the infant, as a result, were much more alert and much less withdrawn. And you see that continued effect on Synchrony, so that every time point between birth and 20 years, the Kangaroo Care children had greater synchrony with their mothers. So Synchrony is something that once it starts, it's rewarding and it continues. And if it starts well, it really fits itself to become a much better relationship. And that line of synchrony across the 20 years is important. Keep it in mind, because that would shape the child's social brain at 20 years. Vagal tone, heart rhythms, even though there were no differences at pre-Kangaroo, the maternal-infant contact accelerated the development of the autonomic system, and they had higher vagal tone before they left at discharge, before they left the hospital, just like you see from the finding in animal models. And the same with sleep organization. We set 20-some years ago, we were very low tech, so we set for 4 hours at the bedside, and we measured every 10 seconds the infant sleep and wake state, and we saw that those infants who received the Kangaroo Care spent more time at the 2 ends, either in quiet sleep or in awake state. And they didn't spend time in those drowsy states that you don't get rest because you don't really sleep, but you're not really alert because you're not really awake and focused. And this kept on, prepared for the child a system that could rest and relax on the one hand, and can be attentive and alert on the other. At 3 months, what we did was we presented the infant with 17 stimuli that started from unimodal, simple stimuli, and they got to be more and more complex and loud and noisy and multidimensional. And it was in a rhythm. The stimulus was presented for 10 seconds, and then 20 seconds of rest, and then the other stimuli and rest, the other stimuli and rest. The infants who received the Kangaroo Care did better with the cycling, with the rhythmicity, with the oscillation between stimulus on and stimulus off. They were able to attend when the stimulus was on, and they were able to rest and go into low arousal when the stimulus was off. And that sets for a much better information processing system. At 5 years, this led to the development of better self-control. This is a variation of the marshmallow test. After about 2.5 hours of testing, we had a gift that was wrapped, it was put on the table. The experimenter left the room and told the child, "You were so good, you're so nice. I am going to bring you some sweets. Here is a gift for you, but please don't touch it before I return. And I just want to, this one I'm going to play for you. This is one of the control kids. The latency wasn't even 2 seconds. And then obviously hiding your trails. And this kid, I really love her, and you would have seen her at 20. She's an amazing girl. So look at her self-restraint. It is not easy to self-regulate. And it goes on and on. They really actually have to self-regulate for 5 minutes. As far as children's cognitive abilities, we saw that at 6, 12, and 24 months, mental ability was higher and motor ability showed no difference. Mental abilities, we think, wasn't because they had greater IQ. They did not as adults, but because mental ability, the MDI at this stage, measures a lot of persistence and the ability to keep going when the work is hard and focused attention. And I think this is what was the point that was improved in these children, the regulatory component in mental development. And this is what we saw at 5 and 10 years, that general IQ showed no difference between kangaroo and control, but executive functions, the ability to inhibit, the ability to discard irrelevant information, was much better in the children who received contact as neonates, both at 5 and at 10 years. So here we come to the second decade of life, and the question is, do improvements in physiological support system persist to the second decade? Because it would have been enough if they got a head start until they're 10. We don't need that to continue into adolescence. And also, it's very important to see whether when the brain is reorganized with a pubertal transition, we still have the gains from the neonatal period. So we didn't know what we're going to find in the second decade. The question is the long-term effect of maternal contact on stress and immunity, which are specifically the finding from animal models that stress and immune function of the adult animal are impacted by maternal proximity or breaches in maternal proximity. And we wanted to see the effect of maternal contact on the development of the social brain in young adults. So do we see any effect, and what kind of effect on the social brain to premature and healthy premature infants? By now, the children are big. They look like normal kids. There's no difference between them and children who were born in term. In fact, also, we have a parallel cohort of term infant running, so we compared the brain to those of children born in term. Back to autonomic function, and here you see that baseline RSA, baseline respiratory sinusarrhythmia, vagal tone, is still higher for the children at 10 years for the children who received kangaroo care as neonates, meaning that this autonomic basis of social engagement is still better for these children in the second decade. Sleep organization, we got more sophisticated. We had actigraphs. The kids wore actigraph for 5 consecutive nights, and they also had sleep diaries. And what we find, a general index of sleep efficacy was higher for the kangaroo care. But the mean wake bouts is really interesting, and it echoes what they had as babies. So when they had a wake bout during the night, it was shorter. They were able to go back to sleep much quicker. So this is to the system flexibility and the ability to move between sleep and wakefulness, attention and rest, heart rhythms, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So this ability, flexible ability, which develops in relation to the mother's body, was still there when the children were 10 years old. Here is cortisol, and this is diurnal rhythm of cortisol. You measure cortisol I think we had 3 times a day over 3 consecutive days. And then, no, that is at 20 years, sorry. Here, we made the Trier social stress test. The children had to give a public speech in front of very severe judges. It's a German test, and it looks, it feels German. It is, the three judges sit and with very severe faces, and the child has to give a public speech. There was no difference in baseline cortisol, but see it, the stress reactivity. It really stressed the premature infants in the non-kangaroo, the no contact, but the children who received the contact had increase in cortisol, but significantly less. This is the cortisol response over the diurnal rhythmicity of cortisol, and you see much greater cortisol production of the child during the day when the child did not receive kangaroo care. And interestingly, over here, we didn't see it with the other hormones, also of the mother. You should think about how difficult it is, how stressful it is to give birth to a premature infant. It's a very low birth weight premature infant, and raise a premature infant. So here we see more diurnal production of cortisol, both of the child and of the mother. We're talking 20 years later. Okay, so it's a set point of a system. The system goes into a specific mode during a critical period, and then it just keeps on functioning in the same way. And what we also measure is salivary IgA, hemoglobin A. This is an immune biomarker. It's a mucosal barrier, the first mucosal barrier of pathogens. It goes hand in hand with cortisol. So the more stress there is, the greater the SGA production to protect against stress. And here you see no differences in the mom, but significant differences. So there's a greater production of diurnal cortisol, and also greater production of the greater activation of the immune system. It's like the immune system is constantly fighting the increased stress. And here we come to the last portion of my talk, and this is the brain. So we had the kids imaged. They were between 18 and 20 years, and we had several paradigms of social and attachment function. And this is an empathy task we actually got from someone at UCLA. And you show a child they're not children anymore, young adults, in the magnet, 4 pictures of 3 emotional conditions. And you tell them, try to put yourself in the shoes of this person. So this person lost an important sport competition, or this person lost his job, or this person got a bad mark on an important test. And then you have 4 pictures representing the statement. This person might be fired soon. This person won an important sport competition. This person, his girlfriend just said yes when he proposed. There are several sad, anxious, and happy episodes, and then there are pictures. And these are compared to neutral pictures. This person is tying his shoes, and to scrambled images, where it's the same pictures, but they're scrambled just to control for visual processing. So I'm going to show you just the very basic. Here you see there are many areas that participate in the neural empathic response, some subcortical, some paralimbic, insula, amygdala, areas of the default mode network, temporal pole, temporal areas. But here I want to show you in yellow something that's very strange, because you see the midline area of the brain, which is basically the brain's dopamine factory, where dopamine is produced. And you see something, I rarely see it differences between groups. That you see above very large activation in the kangaroo care children, and no activation in the control children. And you see a much greater temporal in the STS. STS is a keynote of the mentalizing system, where what we use to interpret others' emotions. And when we looked more closely, we saw that the contrast that really was the cause of this great difference is the happy. It's the happy versus neutral. So you tell a child, this person is really happy because his girlfriend just said yes to his marriage proposal and put yourself in that person's shoes. Or this person just won an important sports competition. And you see VTA, the subcortical reward dopamine, something from the gut activation in the kangaroo care children. And you see a much more controlled top-down cortical response of the STS in the non-kangaroo. So there is something about being close to the mother's body that 20 years later, you're able to respond to someone else's fortune, not misfortune, fortune and joy and happiness with this kind of subcortical dopamine. You could elicit reward, your brain's reward system, to the joy of someone else. And that is something that comes in contact with a mother's body. What we're doing now is a much more complex analysis. We're using multivariate RSA that shows the different patterns of brain, not the degree of activation, but different patterns of the brain empathic system. And we see that while there are no differences between the groups, children, the experience of synchrony across development is what predicts whether children would show differences in brain response to different emotion. So they show specific, we call it empathic accuracy. They show specific response to happiness, specific response to others' distress, and specific response to others' strangeness. And what predicts this across development is the degree of synchrony that you received throughout your development that really prepared you to see, is the other person attentive? Is the other person happy? Is the other person maybe looking for a rest from the interaction? Synchrony is like a micro experience in differential empathy, in empathic accuracy assessing. And those kids who received kangaroo care received much greater synchrony, and that predicted their brain response to be much more with reward and much more specific, respond in a much more specific way to others' distinct emotions. So to conclude, this is the first longitudinal study in humans showing that maternal bodily contact carries long-term effects on the maturation of child biological rhythms. Better organization of the child's biological rhythms carries long-term effect on relationships, biological periodicities, emotion regulation, and sociality. Predictable, matched, synchronous interactions provide the context for the development of the neural empathic response. Thanks to my students who carried out these projects, thanks to our funders, and specifically to the Mann chair that enabled us to carry the imaging study.